Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, if you're on the West Coast. I'm Christos Xenofondos. I'm the Assistant Director for Administrative Services at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation and the Chair of AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management. I would like to warmly welcome all of the panelists and attendees to today's Transportation Performance Management webinar. AASHTO's Transportation Performance Management Technical Service Program, for which I hope all states are participating, and this is a great time if you are not a member to actually, sign up for it, as most of the states have been getting the annual bills from AASHTO. So the TSP program is thrilled to co-sponsor this Transportation Performance Management webinar series in collaboration with the Committee on Performance-Based Management and co-sponsored by Federal Highway. Next slide, please. So this is our 27th bi-monthly webinar. Through these webinars, we aim to support the broad TPM community, and through this series by sharing lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the transportation performance management community. Today's webinar will feature speakers from High Street Consulting, the Virginia Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, and Minnesota DOT, exploring methodologies for assessing the post-implementation outcomes of transportation projects, from quantitative metrics like traffic flow and safety improvements to qualitative insight based on stakeholder feedback. For more information on this webinar series, please visit tpm-portal.com and navigate to events in the main menu and then select TPM webinar series. You'll also find archives of previous webinars and links to video and slides from today's webinars, which will be posted on the site. And Connor already has shared in the chat the link. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics, or if you have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's chat feature. We'll answer the questions during the panelist discussion at the end of the webinar. If you haven't already, please be sure to mute your audio so that our presenters are not interrupted. And thank you for doing that. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the webinar series is always to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the performance management community. And for this webinar, the primary learning objectives are to share information about NCHRP Project 08170, closing the loop, post-implementation evaluation of transportation projects, share best practices and strategies for post-project implementation review, and examine lessons learned from agencies' post-implementation experiences. Whether you're a performance management practitioner or a project manager, this webinar will get straight to the heart of what we are all about as public agencies, which is creating public value for our citizens and society. To better understand the return on investment and public value created by our projects, we must start by measuring it. And by the way, if you want to learn more and help steer these conversations on organizational performance measures, meaning the ones that we want to deploy ourselves to manage our organizations and outcomes, our subcommittees are always looking for active volunteers. Next slide, please. Just a quick rundown of the agenda. We'll introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, they are Kevin Ford with High Street Consulting, who's going to present on Beyond the Build, evaluating transportation project outcomes. Beverly Quinlan with the Virginia Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, presenting on assessing performance of completed smart-scale projects. And Michael Iacono from Minnesota DOT, presenting on Minnesota DOT's experience with post-implementation project evaluation and prospects for future application. Just another reminder to please put your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to cover them later. As we said earlier, yes, the slides and the video will be available after today's webinar at tpm-portal.com, which is why we are recording it. Next slide, please. Oh, before we go to that, So welcome from Ashto. As before we get starting today, just to provide a brief Ashto welcome on behalf of Anna McLaughlin, who is the Program Director for Transportation Program Management, who's not able to join us today. Anna is the Ashto Staff Liaison for the Committee on Performance-Based Management and is responsible for managing the work with the Committee on Planning and Committee on Data Management and Analytics. In this position, Anna provides leadership on ASHTO's policy and technical activities related to transportation performance management, asset management, planning, and data management. CPPM is very pleased to sponsor the webinar series in collaboration with Federal Highway and the TPM TSP. It's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics and to connect with the performance management community. To that point, we'd like to remind you that the Committee on Performance-Based Management is convening this September for its annual business meeting, as well as an ASHTO-sponsored performance management PR exchange. We'd love to see you there. The PR exchange will be taking place on Tuesday, September 23rd, and will be followed up with the annual meeting of the committee on Wednesday and Thursday, 24th and 25th of September. Please note that while the PR exchange is limited to state employees only, the annual meeting of the committee is open and to all, and we welcome everybody there. Again, today's webinar will showcase the ongoing NCHRP Project 08170 and other leading best practices in post-implementation to enhance transportation outcomes. We have some fantastic speakers lined up for you, and we can't wait to share their expertise and get the conversation started. Anna asked me to express her appreciation to everyone for your participation today, and we're so sorry she could not attend. And on behalf of all of us, I also want to extend appreciation to Abigail and the great SPY Partners team, for their support of their webinar series. All right, so now we'll hear from our first panelist, Kevin Ford. While we are queuing up the slides for Kevin, Kevin is a partner at High Street, where he leads the firm's work on performance-based planning and project prioritization. With 18 years of experience, he has helped more than 50 transportation agencies make smarter investment decisions by using data to understand the impacts of their policies and to rank projects more effectively. Kevin is the lead researcher for a national study on how agencies evaluate the real-world results of completed projects, which he looks forward to discussing with all of you today. Kevin, all yours.
All right, thank you, Christos. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. I'm excited to talk to you all today about an ongoing research study that we're leading on post-implementation evaluation. This is a study that High Street's leading, along with our partners at Red Engineering and Inshore Studio, and on behalf of our esteemed panel of NCHRP practitioners. So today I'm going to kick off the session with a high-level overview of some of the challenges and kind of draft framework strategies we've come up with to address those challenges to more readily implement post-implementation evaluation, or PI for short, because we love acronyms. I'll then turn it over to my co-presenters from Virginia and Minnesota, who helped advise on our framework and can share their own practical experience implementing PI. So as Christos mentioned, this is for the study project number 08170, which is focused on closing the loop, meaning that we're trying to monitor the efficacy of our investments post-construction to better inform the next planning and programming cycle. But not only that, we recognize that PI represents a clear opportunity to demonstrate stewardship by transparently communicating the return on the public's investment. So I'll walk through some of the challenges and strategies today. Now, there's no shortage of questions that PI can really help answer. For our purposes, we are really focused on kind of three different levels. We're trying to come up with frameworks that would help use PI to understand what are investments buying us in terms of if historically we spend X amount of dollars, what has that meant towards the performance gains we've seen in the system? So we've looked at this at the program level. We also looked at the corridor level. So even if we don't have rich data sets, we still get some statistical evidence of if we built something, how well is that site performing compared to similar sites where we did not do such an improvement? We've also used PI to look at the project level, just trying to understand what is the benefits that could be attributed to an individual project or set of projects. And that way we can make sure that we're prioritizing efforts that are going to give us the most bang for our dollar. Our analysis can also help inform both internal and external processes. So internally, we can use the lessons learned from post-construction analysis to help better calibrate our forecasting models to make better decisions. But it can also be used externally to take credit for your easy wins and kind of communicate what has been the return on the investment that these agencies have been given stewardship of. Now, to go about this research study, we conducted an extensive literature review, as well as conducted a survey and interviewed several practitioners, many of which I was happy to see on the participant list here today. But when we talked to folks, we heard there are both organizational and technical challenges that stand in the way of post-implementation evaluation, where really the organizational challenges were more difficult to overcome. On the organizational side, the biggest challenge we heard is that a lot of agencies struggle with having sufficient resources. Staffs are stretched thin, are just trying to stay ahead of what is the next thing coming down the pipeline that we can plan for. But really, if we have more resources, we can invest that time to look backwards to see, well, what have we learned so we can make better decisions and hopefully save enough resources that would more than compensate the cost of having additional staff focused on PI. As of right now, there's no real PI role defined in a lot of these agencies we talk to. Other challenges we heard is that ignorance can truly be bliss sometimes, meaning that there's oftentimes a fear of exposing results when they didn't turn out exactly as we hoped. Or maybe they did, but the results are just being misinterpreted. So there really needs to be a better culture to encourage folks to, even if they do fail, that we can still learn lessons from that and get better the next time. Another challenge we heard was on communicating counterfactuals, meaning that sometimes a project may not have a clear benefit, but it prevented something much worse. And this is a really hard story to tell, to take credit for why that investment was worthwhile. On the technical side, the main challenge that we heard was really time, meaning that some of these projects, it takes quite a bit of time for those benefits to accumulate. If you think of, say, a big major capacity addition project, that project may take multiple years to construct, followed by a period of traffic behavior renormalizing, followed by land use changes, and only then do you start to see some economic development impacts. So if you're trying to understand how many jobs are created by a project, well, that might be like a decade-long span of time, over which there's a lot of external factors happening that are outside of an agency's control. So maybe there's population growth or other changes that can mask the true benefit that was associated with the project. So one of the technical challenges we've had to overcome this research is to identify ways to help control for that external noise and focus on what is the true benefit that was realized from a project. Other challenges we heard were around data variability, so just having consistent data sets over time and collection methods. Whereas if they're not being consistent, it can be hard to compare performance before and after an analysis or after a project constructed. So we need to have consistent crosswalks to make sure we're interpreting data in the right context. And then lastly, technically, we also heard that there's some challenges with defining, well, where the impacts could extend beyond a construction limit. So how do you decide how far to go beyond the construction limits? So if you think about, again, that winding project, maybe the benefit isn't observed within limits, but it's on alternative routes that folks would have taken. So how do you know which routes to include in your post-implementation evaluation of benefits? Given that understanding of challenges, the research team has worked with our panel to identify 8 steps for a draft framework that blends organizational and technical strategies together. The guidebook associated with this effort will be released hopefully on the spring or summer of next calendar year, and we'll give more details on each of these. Real quickly, we focused on how do you make the case for conducting post-implementation evaluation? So how do you communicate to executives that PI isn't necessarily a new thing, but it's just a better way of doing business. That finding some cost savings on a major project or a program, multiple small projects, having a little bit more efficiency gain can make up for a lot of those resources you'd have to invest to study post-implementation evaluation. We've also looked into identifying who needs to be involved in conducting PI. When you're looking at post-implementation evaluations, it often does take a village. You need folks familiar with the financial data associated with projects. You need technical staff who understand the performance before and after and can interpret that data in the right context. You need TPM professionals who can help coordinate the effort, etc. So how do you make sure you have the right group of folks in the room so you can conduct this evaluation and disseminate those results in a meaningful way? In the third step of our framework, we focus on how you define the problem. Oftentimes, PI is done on an ad hoc basis. We're really looking at kind of audits and major high dollar projects. But when we talk to folks, there's also some interest in maybe focusing on some quick wins. So maybe you look at some small programs and snowball your effort. You can demonstrate how PI works, what the benefits are, and then scale up from there. So the third step is kind of giving some guidance around choosing which projects to start with. In our fourth step here, we give some guidance on how do you establish evaluation parameters, meaning what are the measures you want to monitor over time, as well as what is the contextual data that you're going to need to interpret those results given all that external noise. So we give some guidance on identifying what those metrics could be, how long you want to monitor those results, and over what areas. In the fifth step here, we have some guidance around building that data library. So oftentimes there's siloed data sets, so you need a way to be able to bring those together into a centralized repository, oftentimes a spatial repository. But not only that, you also need to have a storage of kind of an archive of historical data sets. So when you go back in time, you can understand the true context of what was the before, during, and after conditions that were at that project's construction site. In the sixth step, I'll go over this in a little bit in just a minute here, but there are different types of analyses that can be conducted depending on the business question you're trying to answer. So we can come up with some different methodologies that account for different levels of data maturity. In the seventh step, we focus on how you communicate the results of your findings. So really kind of thinking through, do you want to communicate each individual project's results, or do you aggregate those? Do you put out infographics, dashboards, etc.? Trying to figure out what is the best way to disseminate those results and make sure they're interpreted correctly. And then the last step of our framework is focused on implementing those enhancements. So how do you define what policies can be updated based on your findings? So maybe you're going to use your post-implementation evaluations to inform future resource allocations or scoping decisions, or even how you prioritize projects. So in the guidebook, we'll have some details on each of those steps. I'm going to step back and talk just generally first on the technical side before we shift to the organizational. When you think about conducting post-implementation evaluation, there's really two general approaches to think about. There's the with and without, as well as before and after types of analyses. So in the left here, a with and without study is really a cross-sectional analysis. We're kind of looking at a snapshot in time and trying to find evidence that, within that time, if one set of locations had improvement, another set had similar characteristics but not have the improvement, can we find statistical evidence that one outperformed the others to suggest that the improvement really did have a clear benefit? The before and after analysis is more focused on a longitudinal analysis. So here you're looking at a defined geography, but look at performance over time. So it's more of a traditional before and after where you can observe a benefit or compare it to a projection. In reality, you can always mix and match these two approaches. So maybe it's both cross-sectional and longitudinal where you're taking into account some panel effects, etc. To give more examples of this, we focused on three general frameworks, again, of different levels of data maturity. The first one you see here on the screen is focused at that program level. So what this is all about is using regression-like techniques to explain any changes in observed performance relative to maybe historical changes in spending or other external factors. So for instance, we could try to predict performance as a function of that spending and external factor like VMT or population growth. The key here is trying to understand what is a reasonable lag in those observed benefits from when you attributed that spending. So basically you have to think through what is the typical construction duration of the projects you're evaluating. If you could tie past spending to performance, you can then start to look at the coefficients and use that to guide your policies. So for instance, the coefficient of spending here would tell you, for every dollar we spend, here's the estimated change in performance based on what we observed. Likewise, you could see what is the relative influence of external factors and how does that help or hurt the actual performance relative to what the spending was buying you. So this is a relatively simple data set that could be applied statewide or regionally. A lot of folks we assume would have access to that type of information. The second framework we looked at was more at the quarter level. So here we understand that not everyone may have historical archives of data sets available to do before and after. So we looked more at a with and without analysis. So for example, we can define different peer groups. Maybe there are sites with similar ADT, lane counts, etc. And we can isolate those that had an improvement or a design element versus those that did not. We can then use these two sample or Welsh t-tests to determine how confident are we that performance really differs between these two types of sites, and what is the average benefit observed between the means of those that had improvement versus those without. This at least gives some statistical evidence to suggest what the typical benefit has been of a past project without a lot of data needs. The most complex framework we looked at was at that project level. So here is now what we're really looking at before and after analysis. But the waters can quickly get muddied. So if you think about, say, we'll look at a delay metric. So suppose we're trying to understand the benefits of reducing delay due to an expansion project. Well, at that same location, maybe there's been several other projects that are associated with it. So maybe they're done in spatial proximity or we're done within a year or two of each other. So if you have multiple projects at a site, how do you start to isolate those benefits? So for our framework, we'll give some guidance around how you screen for different project types, trying to understand which ones realistically impact that metric. So if we're talking about delay, maybe the preservation projects we can take off the list as not having a meaningful impact. For the second step here, we're trying to identify what is the influence area of that project. So again, thinking beyond just the construction limits, but what are those alternative routes that might be impacted by said project? So if we're doing a capacity analysis, maybe as a winding project, here we can think about using a traveler map model or similar routing type analysis to say, what are those parallel routes or alternative routes that people would have taken? Maybe there's some induced demand within the project limits that actually show worse performance, but because people transition from the arterials, there's some travel time benefits observed on those routes. So just trying to find what are those additional routes we should be monitoring for delay metrics. Then, if you still have overlap between the influence areas and multiple projects, now we need to start apportioning the benefits of, well, which project most contributed to that delay reduction. Recognize that may be multiple projects working together to deliver that actual impact you observed in situ. So for this, we have some guides around isolating the project types, and maybe looking at peer sites where they only had a single expansion project, and you can proportionally then apportion what the benefit has been of those project types in isolation. Finally, once you've apportioned the benefits, we can start to calculate different changes. We can see what has been the before and after, maybe year one after a project, year two after a project, et cetera, and use that to extrapolate trends or to calculate what has been the typical change of not only this project, but all projects of a similar type that you can then use for different use cases. So this is something where maybe the average impact is used for prioritization purposes. You could say expansion project gets X% of the points because it has the most defensible impact on delay relative to these other project types. Now, to support each of these technical frameworks, the research team has developed a spreadsheet-based tool that we're hoping to be released alongside the guidebook next spring. Here, it's a macro-free spreadsheet that demonstrates the three methodologies. It also includes a self-assessment questionnaire to help folks gauge their readiness for post-invitation evaluation. But the point I really want to close with here is thinking more about the organizational strategies, recognizing that enterprise-wide PI is probably going to take a while. It's a new concept to a lot of agencies. So from our research, what we're hearing is that it would really be beneficial to start thinking about things incrementally. Maybe we start with more of a decentralized approach where our TPM professionals are providing training and tools and resources to help each program owner conduct their own evaluations. Once you start to gain some support, maybe this is something that could be moved to more of a cohesive kind of centralized structure. And so you can kind of see some of the examples of what an ultimate PI organizational strategy could look like on the screen here. So TPM could be folks that are helping to coordinate these analyses. The plan programming staff could help to start to define goal-aligned metrics that you're monitoring over time. The technical divisions, be it bridge, pavement, safety, et cetera, can help share the metric data, support the analyses, and make sure they're interpreted in the right context. You can bring in finance people to bring cost information to better understand maybe how effective the delivery mechanisms have been. IT staff will be needed to maintain those historical data sets and hosting dashboards to display the results. And if things are all going well, maybe bring in legislative affairs and public involvement staff to help craft strategic messaging around how well our products have actually been performing. So again, really with PI, what we're trying to do is come up with this framework that'll help implement a PI culture, get the right folks in the room to be looking back at their projects, quantifying what the benefits have been, and using those lessons learned for more cost-effective management moving forward. So with that, I just want to thank all those who attended this portion of the sessions today, and I'll look forward to the dialogue after our other speakers present. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And, once again, as we said earlier, please, put your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of all the presentations. Next, we'll hear from Beverly Quinlan. Beverly joined the performance management team at the Virginia Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment within the Office of the Secretary of Transportation in 2018. Prior to that, she spent 5 years at the Virginia Department of Transportation in the Transportation and Mobility Planning Division. Beverly?
Thanks for the introduction. Kevin, I think you need to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine. Great, thank you. Can you see my screen with the presentation?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Today, I'd like to share some information about how we assess the performance of completed SMART scale projects. I'll begin the presentation with a little background information about what SMART scale is and how it fits into our performance-based planning and programming process. Then I'll give a brief overview of how we complete our before-after analysis. Next, I'll touch on some of our results, and finally, I'll end with what our next steps are. SMART scale is the name of the prioritization process adopted by statute in 2014 for Virginia's multimodal transportation needs. It's set up as an application program, and in 2015, the first applications were accepted into the process. Projects are scored and ranked in 6 categories: safety, congestion, accessibility, economic development, land use, and environment. The scores and a staff recommended scenario based on funding policy are provided to the Commonwealth Transportation Board to inform their project selection decisions. SMART scale is an important part of Virginia's performance-based planning and programming process, what we call the transportation investment cycle. Starting with plan is VTRANS, the statewide multimodal transportation plan that sets goals and objectives and identifies and prioritizes transportation needs using a data-driven process. Next up is develop with Project Pipeline, which is a study program that aims to provide a stream of projects that address the VTRANS priority needs. These studies are intended to support applications for SMART scale. Then on to invest, which for this presentation, we're just focusing on the SMART scale prioritization process and the corresponding funding programs. The key point here for SMART scale is that the applications must meet a VTRANS need to be eligible. Finally, we have manage. This is where we take a step back and we try to understand how the transportation system is performing and if our programs are having the desired impact. We evaluate outcomes and make recommendations for improvements. Performance management and continuous process improvement is really the focus of this presentation. Process improvement can be a sensitive topic because sitting behind the surface is the implication that things weren't done well in the past. So it's important to clearly state your goals, what I'm calling a continuous improvement mindset, where we acknowledge that usually programs have room for improvement. And we look to the past to understand where we can make course corrections, but we're not critical of the past or past decisions. The past is good because we can learn from it. For SMART scale, the past that we need to look at are the completed projects. Did they deliver the anticipated benefits? Through SMART scale, benefits are estimated or predicted. So once a project is completed, we do a before-after analysis to see if those benefits were realized. This will help us understand where improvements can be made. I want to give a little more background into SMART scale. applications for SmartScale are currently accepted every other year in what we call rounds. This table gives a summary for rounds 1 through 5, but round 6 was just completed. For the first 5 rounds, over 2,000 applications were submitted and 776 projects were selected for funding at a value of $14.5 billion. As of 2022, 150 of these projects have been constructed, with 147 completed by September 2022, which was the cutoff period for our analysis. This gave us a 3-month shoulder period since we're averaging performance over calendar years. Looking at our completed projects that we analyze in the before-after analysis, we have 147 projects with a total cost of $782 million. Most of the projects are highway focused, but there are a variety of improvement types. These projects are constructed all across the state in urban and rural areas. And however, most of the projects are smaller and low in cost, with 91% costing less than $10 million. When choosing how to evaluate our completed projects, we look to the factor areas used in SmartScale. Some of the SmartScale factor areas lend themselves to quantitative measures, while others are more qualitative. For some factor areas, we could replicate the measure used in SmartScale, but for others, we could not. Sometimes this was due to data availability, and other times the original SmartScale measure was more of a synthetic measure than something that you could actually measure in the real world. For several factor areas, we have yet to identify a data source to create a measure. This is a very high-level overview of how we analyze individual projects. Safety and congestion are the factor areas for which we have the most rigorous performance measures. We have a semi-automated process, and the basic analysis steps start with retrieving the project location from the application, followed by a manual process to identify the source data, what we call segmentation. We have developed a segmentation guide and training materials so that this manual process can be conducted in a consistent manner. Generally, this process is completed in GIS software, with the analyst reviewing project details to determine what crashes or what travel time data segments to include in the analysis. Finally, we have an automated process that calculates the performance measures from the source data generated during the segmentation process. I wanted to share one example project with you today. This project is an R-cut that limits left turn movements. Prior to the installation of this project, there was a 2-way stop-controlled intersection. This project received the majority of its score in SmartScale from the safety factor area. To score high in the safety factor area, this intersection would have had a history of crashes. Our before-after analysis found that there had not been any fatalities in the 4 years post-construction and only 1 serious injury crash. Compare this to the 5-year period pre-construction that included 1 fatal injury crash and 4 serious injury crashes. We'll make our final evaluation of this project when we have 5 years of post-construction data to review. Overall, the reduction in fatal and all injury crashes was 47%, and that's compared to a projected or forecasted reduction of 35% from the SmartScale scoring process. So this project exceeded expectations. When reviewing our results, we have focused on a number of items, including consistency between the observed and predicted performance, achievement of the project goals. We look at results by project type. We aggregated the performance of all the projects together as a single portfolio. We looked for observations that would support improvement to the SmartScale prioritization process and policies. We also tried to collect other data that would help us understand the project outcomes, like bicycle and pedestrian counts and park and ride lot surveys. Overall, we found that 95% of the projects improved or maintained safety, congestion, or both. And 65% of the projects were found to be consistent with the smart scale estimation of benefits. Certain project categories performed really well, like new turn lanes and interchange improvements and widening projects. We've also made some observations to feedback into the process improvement. We found that some improvement types had overestimated crash reductions predicted in smart scale. This is an issue that had already been identified and corrected during the smart scale post-round lessons learned session. After every round of smart scale, the team does a lessons learned session to digest all the issues that folks identified during the scoring process. The before and after analysis also revealed an overestimation of park and ride lots. This number is an assumption used in the congestion scoring process. This item is currently under review for a correction before the next round of applications are accepted. The before-after analysis has also brought to light some issues related to policy. We observed many projects that had a majority of their score coming from the environmental factor area that had limited benefits in congestion and safety. Like some of our other observations, this issue had already been identified and corrected after a lessons learned session. We also found a lot of small projects with very limited benefits. While small projects can be very beneficial, this runs somewhat counter to the program goals. And after a recent comprehensive program review, the policy has been updated to try and favor larger projects of statewide and regional significance. In the spirit of continuous process improvement, our before-after analysis process certainly has room for improvement. We're currently working on a number of projects to improve our analysis and the understanding of the results. We're currently working to design and implement a cross-sectional approach or reference sites in addition to our longitudinal work to look at performance at similar locations, both with and without improvements. And that's something Kevin mentioned in his presentation. With this, we hope to get a better understanding of confounding factors that affect project results. We're also looking at other data sources to address data gaps and data quality issues that we've noticed. And we're also conducting what we call desktop reviews, which is an in-depth review of data, the source data used to evaluate the project for projects that didn't perform as well as expected. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly, for the presentation as well. And finally, we will hear from Michael Iacono. Michael is a performance and investment data analyst with Minnesota DOT's Office of Transportation System Management, where he has worked since 2017. His work involves measurement of travel time reliability and other aspects of performance on the national highway system, as well as some work with program evaluation and economic analysis. Michael, all yours.
Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for the introduction, Christos. This is a topic that is personally of interest to me. It's one that I think is a bit underappreciated in the planning process. So it's good to see the NCHRP project moving forward and that AASHTO is doing its part to promote this concept. So I'll state at the outset that, like many states, MnDOT doesn't have a formal systematic program for doing post-implementation project evaluation. But what we do have is at least one concrete example. There may be others, if there are people within the organization watching who know about them, please let me know. But there's one particular evaluation that we do of a state statutorily mandated program that we conduct every 2 years. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this. The program is called Quarters of Commerce, and I'll be describing it in more detail. I'll give you an example of how we run through this type of analysis. So the Quarters of Commerce program is a program that's about 12 years old now. It was authorized by the Minnesota State Legislature to provide money for corridor highway improvements. And the money can go for a whole range of uses. So it funds everything from preparatory work, things like environmental analysis, and even right-of-way evaluation on up to the provision of passing lanes on 2-lane rural highways, all the way up to 4 to 6 lane urban freeway expansions and major interchange reconstruction. And interestingly enough, one of the things that was written into the state statute is that there needed to be an evaluation done every 2 years, every even number year. Obviously, you can see this is not an even number year. If it was, I probably wouldn't be able to attend this particular event. But there's also a requirement that the work be done by an independent entity. So this could mean either hiring an outside consultant to do the analysis or having somebody within the program to do the work, but it has to be somebody who's separated from the operation of the program and the project selection process. And I fit the bill on that one, so I've been handling the management about the evaluation for the last 4 cycles. So in the initial legislation that authorized Quarters of Commerce, there were a set of 8 statutory project scoring criteria. These are, you can see them on the left here. And when grant applications are evaluated and scored, these 8 criteria are used and are each given equal weight. And these criteria have been used to inform the design of the program evaluation. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that some of these criteria are a bit more qualitative in nature, which makes them a bit less easy to evaluate in a post-construction project evaluation. So we've selected a subset of those. And as much as I'd like to take credit for the design of the program, that was actually the work of my colleague, John Wilson, who initially came up with the analysis framework. And I've been implementing that since about 2018. So there's an emphasis on quantifiable outcomes here, and I'll tell you what those are. So there are a set of basically 4 program evaluation areas. The first is a couple of characteristics related to project delivery. So one, looking at the project schedule and timing. So how did the project evolve? When was it implemented relative to when it was expected to be completed at the time of the grant application? How did costs perform? So how did the costs proceed from early estimations, early engineers' estimates, all the way up to the final project cost? There's a second criteria based on effects of vehicle speeds, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. We make use of the MPMRDS Pro data set to look at individual projects there. And a third set based on safety impacts of these projects. So we take a look at both total crash rates for the area where a project was implemented, and also a subset of fatal and serious injury crash rates. Then the final set of outcomes are related to freight movement. So in that case, we're looking at things like changes in commercial truck volumes on the affected area. So that first set is related to project delivery, involves not just the scheduling, but also tracking the project costs over time. So this table you're seeing there shows what we do with each of the projects. We begin with the original construction estimate and then follow through to the engineer's estimate, the cost at awarded bid, and then the final amount. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing up until now is that there hasn't been a whole lot of variation in these costs through the various phases of it. The one example that you can see here is that Highway 14 project, which was actually a design build project, in which the scope of the project changed a bit from that original construction estimate to the final design. It actually occurred in a couple of different phases, which affected the cost estimates. And when we look at vehicle speeds, we have a couple of different data sources we use. As I mentioned, the main source is the MPMRDS Analytics Data Downloader. Some of you may be familiar with this tool. The analytics platform is what's used by the majority of states for evaluating travel time, reliability, and delay measures on the national highway system. But it also has this feature where you can download data for specific segments on the network. So you can get, in the case of this evaluation, we can look at specific project areas and identify a set of segments that they're called traffic message channels in this particular application, and pull probe data for specific sets of specific sets of 10 to 15 minutes on up to an hour, which is typically what we use for the analysis. A second data source is the Streetlight Insight platform that we make use of, which has pro data analytics that can be used for a number of different applications, including traffic volume estimation. But you can also measure speeds for specific locations. And we've had a few different cases where we either had a project that was not on the national highway system, so we couldn't get data from NPM RDS analytics, or there were recent changes in the network which weren't quite in that analytics platform, and so we had to use a different method to actually identify the project location. And so now we have about a dozen or so projects that have been evaluated. So this is the most recent report where we're looking at the change in observed speeds from 2014, which was the first year of the program, up until 2023. And these projects kind of run the gamut. Most of them provide increases in speed from anywhere from, say, 8 miles an hour up to about 12. The one example on the right there is a project where it was a 4 to 6 lane urban expansion on a freeway up in the northern part of the Twin Cities, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, where there was pretty severe congestion prior to completion of the project. And since then, there have been significant increases in average speeds during the peaks. So it went from about 42 or so miles an hour up to around 60 miles an hour, which is the posted speed limit. And then there's the crash analysis component. I mentioned we look at both total crash rates and also fatal and serious injury crash rates. So the graph here produces the crash rates for projects per 100 million vehicle miles. You can see the bars indicate both before and after conditions, and then there's also a third bar which indicates the statewide average for that particular class of roadway and particular volume level. The final area that we look at, and this one has probably been the most difficult to complete, is the commercial truck volume analysis. So what we're looking at here is just asking the question whether these projects facilitate increases in truck volume. And we're looking at growth rates for the affected area and evaluating them relative to a statewide trend. So if statewide heavy commercial VMT is growing at 2%, and the traffic growth in the particular affected area is 4%, we can attribute about 2% of that growth to the project itself. And so we produce these graphs for each of the projects. This is an example of a particular passing lanes project on US Highway 2 up in northern Minnesota. It's a 2-lane highway with relatively low traffic volumes, probably around 3,000 vehicles a day, and maybe 10% of that is heavy commercial truck growth. And this is an example of an area where the population growth rate is relatively low and stable, and so we should see a growth rate which is basically hovering around 0. That's an example of a fairly stable outcome. And there are a few different types of traffic data collection methods that we use. So our traffic data and analysis unit, which we call TDA, likes to visualize their different data collection methods in the form of a pyramid. And what this indicates is that at the top of the pyramid are a few different data collection methods which provide more different types of data, but they're typically limited in scope because they're relatively expensive to provide and to maintain and collect data from. So these are, at the top of the pyramid are the weigh in motion sites. These are continuous count stations which also collect information on axle loadings, axle spacing. And these are typically the best way that we have to identify, to do vehicle classification and identify heavy commercial trucks. At the bottom of the pyramid are total volume counts. And these are the most widely available. So as the pyramid indicates there are around 36,000 sites statewide, but these are typically lower quality types of data. So they may or may not be collected on an annual basis. They're more often taken in the form of short duration counts. So we might only get 1 or 2 days worth of data from either a manual collection or a pneumatic tube count, or something like a radar sensor. And these are typically the type of data that we're more likely to be working with when we're doing these types of analysis. One issue that has started to appear in more recent years that we've noticed with a number of the projects is some discontinuities in these these heavy commercial volume trends. And these are mostly confined to post-COVID period, which after talking with some of my colleagues over in our transportation data analysis unit, we found out are related to are greater use of passive data collection methods for vehicle classification. So we've been implementing a set of radar-based units. A lot of these are wavetronics units, and also side radar sensors to do traffic volume counts and vehicle classification, which is typically length-based classification in a greater number of locations. So the impetus for this was that, particularly on roadways with higher traffic volumes, they wanted to do a better job of protecting the people who are out there in the field doing maintenance on these sorts of things. So if you can avoid having to go out and actually dig up a piece of pavement, instead put one of these trucks and back them up to the side of a roadway and use that for data collection counts, that means we're doing a much better job protecting our workforce. So the nice thing about these units is that they can be either put in place and kept there for an extended period of time, where you can do continuous counts, or they can be moved from location to location and used at a number of different sites. The drawback of this, of course, is that they're using length-based vehicle classification, which produces a very different set of classification counts for heavy commercial trucks than what we were getting from other sources. And that's what we're seeing in this discontinuity in some of the previous, in some of these growth trends. So what's essentially happening now is we're getting a new, if you're continuing to use these link-based classifications, you basically got a new trend emerging, which is why you see only a short-term spike. So once I wrap up one of these analyses for the year, I usually spend a few days thinking about some things that went well during the evaluation, some things that didn't go so well, areas that we might be able to improve, either in terms of just the technical analysis itself, either they're expanding it to new topics or improving ways that we do existing things. So the commercial truck volume estimation has been the primary technical issue that we've encountered so far, and we're looking at a few different data sources to see if we can get around that. So I mentioned Streetlight earlier in the presentation. They have a method for estimating both total vehicle counts and also truck classification, but they're using basically the same method, and so you get a similar type of bias in the results. We're also looking to do some validation for the length-based versus axle-based classification. So using making use of some of the existing sites, like those weigh in motion sites, as a way to compare them with some of the newer methods, like those wavetronics units. And then just trying to establish where these trends are over time and what they should actually look like. And so that's a kind of a way of establishing that counterfactual. So if we weren't using these new data collection methods in the same location, what would we be actually seeing in terms of growth rates? So one area where we might be able to expand the analysis is to get into the issue of travel time reliability. And a case could be made for adding this one in, because this is already used in the project scoring process for a number of these projects. So it's not too much of a stretch to imagine it also being used as an evaluation criterion for some of these projects, particularly the ones that are concentrated on the national highway system. And lastly, during Kevin's presentation, he talked about some of the statistical evaluation methods. So about whether we could actually do a more rigorous type of evaluation for some of these aspects of project performance. So trying to determine, when we're looking at these different outcomes, are they the result of something that is beyond the bounds of what could be attributed to chance variation in the underlying data? And of course, this is dependent on data quality. So, we probably need better volume data in order to do this. I think we're probably in better position with the speed data to be able to do so. And finally, it's interesting to think about what the prospects might be for scaling this up. I mentioned that this is kind of a one-off type of program that the program evaluation that PennDOT does. So what would it take to scale it up to a larger level? Well, in Kevin's presentation, he mentioned that a common issue is just staffing levels, and that's unavoidable. So doing this work right requires a lot of time and a lot of people being devoted to it. And there's also a certain degree of skill requirements involved. So people need to become familiar with certain data sets and working with certain types of analytical platforms, different pieces of software. That takes time in and of itself, requires training. So those are the main limitations. And there's also the question of who the audience is for all of this, and how you're making the case to them this is a worthwhile piece of work. So the status quo works for most of the people in a particular organization. We have planning processes that are built around coming up with policy documents and selecting projects based on resources available to pursue those goals. And the question is, how do you make the case that there's value in looking at these post-project outcomes and using that feedback to figure out what's working and what's not? That, in my opinion, is the critical part of this. So as far as opportunities for actual impacts, one can think about the possibility of doing some kind of small-scale pilot studies of this. And there are some areas that might be right for these types of applications. For example, in the area of safety. For example, MnDOT, like many states, has a highway safety improvement program through which a lot of projects are funded and could be, in principle, evaluated. And this would require, from MnDOT's perspective, this would require some internal coordination because our particular unit doesn't do most of the safety evaluation. A lot of that's done in our Office of Traffic Engineering, so we would have to coordinate with them. And interestingly enough, they just recently acquired access to a new software program called Crash. It's a product company called Cidian, which allows for some fairly specific queries to be developed and to be able to access the kinds of data that are needed for this kind of safety analysis. So that may be one area where application could lead. And that's the end of my formal presentation for now. And I certainly welcome your questions. Please put them in the chat if you have something, and I'll tell you what I know.
Thank you, Michael. If we could have all of the panelists come on camera, that would be great. And so we're gonna now have Q&A and discussion about the presentations we've just heard. And so we have some prepared questions, but I'll start with the first one, which really follows on Michael's last point in his presentation, which is, how do you balance the costs and the effort of PI with its benefits? And so maybe what we could do is start with Beverly, go to Michael, and then end with Kevin on what he was able to observe through the research. And then I'll switch to the questions that were raised in the chat. If you have more, I'm just going to go through them in the order that people have entered them. And if we have time at the end, I have additional questions. So Beverly.
Thanks. So balancing the cost versus the effort, we really understood upfront how much effort would be involved with evaluating the project. So after our pilot, we started automating as much of the process as we could right away. So with that and good documentation of our process, we feel like we are being as efficient as we can from a resource perspective in doing this process. In addition, our office has a really strong culture of continuous process improvement and lessons learned session after every major initiative. So internally, doing the before-after analysis is a really easy sell. SmartScale is a program with, sort of large dollar signs and large consequences. So improvements to that program can have a really big impact on outcomes.
So when you say automating it, basically when you're doing the scoring of a project, it's set up in a way so you can come back many years later and you can kind of push the button, let's say, and more quickly get to some of the updated score calculations?
So like I mentioned, it's a semi-automated process, and we try to automate the calculation part, but the piece where to add new projects to it, we have a manual process, but the part where the actual measures, all the calculations to calculate like the delay and those sorts of measures is automated. And I think that helps us, go through the process as quickly as possible. Our intent is that we would do this on a regular cycle because SmartScale new projects are added every other year. So there's a constant stream of projects being completed. So we want to be able to keep up with that so we can understand the outcomes and feedback into the SmartScale process to improve that.
Thanks, Beverly. Michael.
Yeah, so I'll echo what Beverly said about the cumulative effect of projects building up over time. So we started this analysis about almost 10 years ago. And at the time, there was a very small number of projects that we were looking at. But each time we go through it, there are a couple of new projects that get added that they're now far enough from being completed that it's possible to get data for some or all of these different areas of application. So we're ultimately constrained by timing. So we typically start this work right around the beginning of summer, and it often runs through around the end of September, then some time for report review and such. But the more projects we get to look at, the less time we can devote to each individual one. So something has to give there. We either have to devote more people to doing the work, and I do have a fair amount of assistance with it, or we just have to limit the depth of the analysis we go into. It's an unavoidable trade-off.
Yeah. Kevin.
Well, hopefully the benefits of doing post-implementation would pay for itself, but I think it's important to recognize that you should just start within the data you have readily available, starting small, not going out and trying to acquire tools to do this right away, and really tailoring your approach to the kind of the importance of the decision you're analyzing. So if it's a small program, maybe you can do more sketch level analysis. If it's a mega project, maybe that entails more of an investment. So I would kind of think through that level of effort and really just focus on those quick wins. And once you have some momentum, you can build some of those automated tools like Beverly was talking about to help streamline future assessments. You can build that sample size and just go from there.
Thank you. All right, let's turn to Craig Casper. I was going to say Casper Craig. Craig, do you want to share your thoughts on ice cream? Maybe not. Craig, are you there?
It looks like Craig's no longer on the meeting.
Okay. All right. Well,
Just make a joke of it.
Just in the comment talked about integrated, coordinated evaluation, considering robust effectiveness analysis methods. Then they could have ice cream with their pie. Cute. Anson, do you want to share your comments and questions?
Sure. First, thanks for the really interesting presentations. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the desk reviews that were mentioned and just kind of lessons learned and maybe forums in which those lessons are discussed.
Sure. So yeah, I mentioned that one of our next steps is the desktop reviews, and it is something that we have done some preliminary work on. And just, I guess, just a couple examples of the types of things that we found. We had one project that was a new signal, and it was anticipated to have a delay reduction, but our analysis found that it didn't. But when we dug in deeper, what we discovered is that the delay savings were projected to be on sort of like the side street. So you had like a main road that had no impediment before, and then a signal was put on it. And as you would expect, that slows down traffic on the main road. But there was a lot of traffic coming from a side street that had a very difficult time making a left-hand turn. Now, unfortunately, the data source that we're using for travel time data just did not have data for that segment. So this is a case where, sometimes the data that you need just does not exist. And it's, unless I guess we could go out and do our own data collection, but using like a third-party data provider, you're kind of stuck with just the data that you have available. Another quick example, we've had some projects, we sort of made a decision. Initially, we would look at the first year post-construction to evaluate whether it did, is it good or is it bad? And sometimes it would indicate that the project performed poorly, but when we look at subsequent years, the project performs well. And sometimes if you dig in, like in one case, there was a large construction, like a parking garage was being constructed, and that disrupted traffic in the area. So because we average our results over the year, that year showed a poorer performance. But then when we look at subsequent years, the performance is actually good. So it's definitely really sensitive to, what data point are you looking at to say the project did good or bad?
Beverly, Craig also had put into the chat, if for your land use effectiveness area, did you examine the assessed valuation within the transit walk distance of the project?
Yeah, I assume the assessed valuation, they mean like the value of the properties within the transit walk distance.
That's how I interpret it.
Yeah. So we would love to have statewide property values, but that is a data set that we can probably get for certain localities, but not all statewide. So initially on our first cut of trying to pick performance measures, we were very sensitive to being able to evaluate all projects equally. So because we couldn't get property values for every parcel in the entire Commonwealth, at this point we haven't pursued those types of measures.
Right. Thanks, Beverly. Edgardo, do you want to share your question?
I think my camera is looking the other way, so I apologize for that.
That's all right. We can hear you.
So yeah, so my question is simply the framework, and this was prompted by Kevin's presentation of looking at the predicted benefit versus the achieved benefit. And it just triggered thinking of like Ezra Hauer's before and after controls, what it does to actually measure the impact that's attributable to the project. So does the framework consider that or adjustment for performance in the intervening time? I'm thinking, maybe not as drastic a disturbance like the pandemic, but something like that would really throw all the baseline numbers out.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ed. I would say when in doubt, I would try to stick to the observed benefit, as that's usually more defensible, unless you have those kind of black swan events like you mentioned with the pandemic, where you just can't even compare the two data points because there's such a gap. But we do know that for some metrics that you may be monitoring for the benefits, that it could be, say, a counterfactual analysis. So you're looking at trying to attribute what was the benefit of a preventive maintenance job. If you just look at the observed data points, you may not see the benefit. So you would have to project out of, well, what would it have been without that treatment? And so similar to how you're mentioned with Dr. Hauer there, you could do a Bayesian kind of forecast to say, given how the control group behaved, that gives me more defensibility for how I think it would have progressed without investment, and use that as your anchor data point to compare to the after state. So it certainly is an additional statistical step that's valid if you are doing a benefit compared to a forecast. But I would try to stick to avoid comparing to forecasts whenever possible, because that can be hard to communicate to leadership. So stick to something where you could say, hey, 4 years ago may not be the full benefits, but here's what it was and here's what it is now. I can really defend that.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? No. All right. Michael, yes?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I can say about it. So I think what Edgardo is getting at is you typically need some kind of counterfactual to evaluate some projects. And we've had limited opportunities to do that. So as I mentioned, the program that we're looking at often involves a variety of projects at different scales, as they have different levels of technical documentation behind them, ranging from, in some cases, fairly sophisticated evaluations, some of which even involve the use of a demand forecasting model, all the way down to basically just the grant application itself, which oftentimes doesn't include a lot of detail. So we try and use that where we can, but it's often fairly limited.
Thanks, Michael. Larry, Red, do you want to share your comment? Let's see, is Larry still with us?
No, Larry's not still with us.
Okay, all right, so Larry.
And Larry's part of the research team, I should just note. So I think his point was just saying that when you look at your external factors, Some of those could be leading indicators for why a project may not perform well. So just mentioning there's a different way to interpret some of those results.
Okay. And Salma, do you want to share your comment for Michael?
It was actually a suggestion to when he was talking about using how about track traffic and Excel based, because the Webtronics only collected length based data. So there are some like non-intrusive video based technology is out there right now. I know New York has been using them for like years now. New Hampshire is also, we have tested some when I was with New Hampshire DOT, and that's what I just provided. Thank you.
Okay. Michael, do you want to?
I addressed the question in the comments section there. So
Yep. Yep.
you can do that first.
Okay. Anson Gawk, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, this is a great presentation. Been looking forward to this for a long time. I'm always interested in before and after studies. I think there should be more of these before and after studies being done to validate many things. And then I'd like to ask a question though. I mean, a lot of times before and after studies, even though there's a lot of good documentation, but there's also a biggest factor is the socioeconomic factors. You know, factory get closed down. I mean, people get laid off, economic changes, and these are pretty big factors. I've seen roadway volume drop from 50,000 to 35,000 because of certain events happen. And this needs to be documented. Sometimes this really is out of our hand. So that's just my point. I mean, I think this is great stuff. I think this is get better planning, but still, we are like still human beings. We don't know what we cannot think about and capture all kinds of events. Thank you, though.
Thanks, Hanson. I definitely have similar thoughts, but I do think that the practice has to mature some, and then maybe there will be better ways to adjust for all those factors. Maybe there'll be some national source for looking at what's happening in trends that really get modeled in. I know, Kevin, you talked about those things, but you know, at the end of the day, there's a lot of them that need to get factored in. So for all of you, and let's start with Michael and go to Beverly, and then Kevin can comment on his observations from the research. So, we're working on this effort. What do you think are the most significant challenges in conducting post-implementation evaluation, and what has been your experience, and what do you think about the continued effort within your agency?
Well, so there are a couple of things that I could talk about there. I mean, I had the one slide where I talked about some of the technical issues that we encountered in doing this analysis. And some of these things we're going to investigate in more detail, and we'll continue to follow up on that commercial, that heavy commercial truck data analysis and see if we can resolve what the underlying growth rate issues there. But there's a second issue here, and that's that, as I mentioned, our audience for that particular report is their state legislature. So we send the report over sometime around the beginning of November, and thus far we haven't gotten any feedback about it. This is something that I think is made public, so I'm pretty sure we publish a link to it on our website. And it might be that we're doing a great job and people just don't see anything wrong with it, but it might equally be the case that people either aren't aware of it or just don't particularly care. So getting that kind of feedback, I think, would be very helpful to see whether what we're doing is appropriate and informative and meeting the actual requirements of the statutory legislation that authorizes.
Beverly?
So I think there's really two challenges that come to my mind. The first is really interpreting the results. We've collected so much data and we have so many results, but it's really difficult to understand, like, what does it all mean? Like, what, to try to sum it up into actionable intelligence, if you will. How much change is significant? What about confounding factors like changes in traffic volume? What about changes in traffic patterns in general? And, of course, we started this process and we kind of had the pandemic like right in the middle of our pre and post construction period. That's been a huge challenge, and that's why we're kind of looking to, we first started to like, well, can we understand our results from a statistical perspective? And then we realized that we don't really have a big enough data set at this point to do that. So that's why we're looking into expanding to sort of the reference site, the with and without, to try to help, give our results more context. And I'd say the second biggest challenge is building external support for the process. Internally, we have a lot of support. We're definitely all about continuous process improvement, but we're trying to improve our messaging to show that this is a forward-looking process. Even though we're examining past projects, it's all about improving the future and not being critical of the past. So we're definitely, that's definitely a challenge, and we're definitely working on our messaging so that people understand our purpose.
Kevin, any thoughts?
I think Beverly hit on most of them. I would say organizationally, biggest challenge is having the resources, particularly when you do not have a legislative mandate to do cost-limitation evaluation. And then technically is just storing that contextual data like Anson and team mentioned. So when people look back, they can really understand why did this occur. And then to help control that, have enough of a sample size of evaluations you've done so you can start to draw conclusions. Any individual project may have a highly variable result, and you don't want to be changing your policies based on 1 or 2 projects. It might take a while of having several, or 10, 20 projects before you can really start to draw conclusions. And that can be difficult for doing this for kind of major projects. So I guess the biggest challenges are just having the resources and knowing when you have enough of an evaluation done to really start to change your policies.
Kevin, I know there's some static with your audio that wasn't there before, but just came in for this last part. So if an agency wants to get started with post-implementation evaluation, what's your advice on how to take their first steps? What is the approach you would recommend? So let's start with Kevin, and then we can go to Beverly, and then to Michael.
Yeah, I would say first steps is just take stock of your readiness to do this. Get a sense of what data is available, is historically available, so you can decide what approach is most reasonable. Then it's picking the right projects, probably where you're focused on quick wins. Maybe it's starting with your small scale projects like safety countermeasures where there's more experience doing kind of before and after analyses. Focus on safety.
Beverly.
Yeah, I'd have to echo a lot of things that Kevin said. But I also would say that, look to maybe ask around your agency and see what existing data sources you have access to. Your other programs might be purchasing something you could use. I think all states have access to the NPM RDS, if I'm not mistaken, and that can be a great resource. But yeah, you might have access to things that you don't know about. So, look around, ask around, and see if you have existing tools so you don't, kind of reinvent the wheel.
Thanks, Beverly. Michael?
Yeah, I guess my advice would be just first to start thinking about which particular outcomes are of most interest to you, which ones you think are most important, and to start taking a look around, seeing what kind of data you have available that could track these kinds of outcomes beyond the completion of the project. And then, you know, you can start asking around to other agencies that may have done this work and find out how they've approached the issue. Or you could ask Kevin and the project team and consult their NCHRP report, find out some ways that you can get started with it.
Thanks. John Andrews mentions, are we missing whether the project was built as designed and specified? And Michael, you responded that you haven't encountered much of this as an issue in your evaluations. Do Beverly or Kevin, do you have any comments on that topic?
I would just say that that is sometimes an issue from what I'm saying of people documenting what the actual scope is intended to be versus where it ends up. So having sufficient data to go back and say, hey, we implemented these countermeasures, these activities is important for more accurate analysis. Otherwise, you have to compile enough of a sample where you kind of look at averages of projects to say, well, it's probably reflective of such an approach. But the more information you have, the better, if you can get it.
Beverly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question with the smart scale application process where localities apply for projects. We found that sometimes the project that is built is not exactly like the project that was applied for. And there's, in fact, a whole sort of change process at VDOT and in coordination with OIPI to actually manage changes that might happen between, you know, when the project was applied for and when it was implemented. So it's amazingly, you would think it would be really easy to know what was built, but it can be very difficult, surprisingly.
Right, you in the middle of a project when they change something, you say, we funded a different project. What do you do? All right, for the final questions from Jesse Rubin, or maybe you have two questions, Jesse, if you want to share it.
Yeah, sure. It's basically the same question. So I'm asking, so Beverly, you mentioned at some point in one of your responses that you found it challenging or that you're working on messaging around how to get folks to use the work that you're doing to use it for forward-looking, like how to be continuously improving going forward, and that's really the benefit of it, and that like changing the mindset from being just really critical of what's happened in the past and how do we use this information to look forward. Can you share some examples of how you've crafted that messaging and what you found successful?
Well, I would say we are currently trying to craft it, and this presentation was kind of one of our attempts. And I guess in some ways it's like, just say it, like, this is for forward looking, you know, we're not going to be, you know, and that's kind of what I put in my slide. We're not going to be critical of the past. We're only looking forward. The purpose of this is process improvement, right? And I guess the hope is, we'll see if it works out. The hope is that, you know, if you say it enough that, you know, people will understand and believe it, that is the sole purpose of this, is just to ultimately improve outcomes. And to improve outcomes, we have to improve our processes.
Michael, any thoughts on getting people to be more forward-looking rather than being critical of the past?
I mean, as I mentioned, ours is a fairly special purpose type of evaluation. And so we're a bit more reactive in that sense. As far as being critical of the past, that's kind of unavoidable. That's part of what this work needs to do. And I don't shy away from that. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at the set of projects that you're evaluating, there are bound to be at least a few of them that produce positive outcomes. And those are things that you can tout to whoever's providing funding and say, well, there's at least something that's working here. Let's find out what it is and whether it can be replicable.
Kevin, any comments on that? Did you observe anything in the research?
I think like that I would add is just understanding that this is really just a data point. It's another piece of information to do your jobs better. It doesn't have to be the end all be all or decide what you do from here on out. But it's contextual information. You can interpret it, explore if you need to get better the next time. So just trying to provide safety numbers with more evaluations and looking at it from that standpoint of we're not going to dictate what you do due to the results, but here's what we found.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a terrific webinar, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with the community. So the next webinar will be held this fall following proceedings from the CPBM annual business meeting in Baltimore. And so be on the lookout for that. And more information will be provided as we get closer to the date of the webinar. Additional webinars will be continuing scheduled every 2 months for the TPM webinars. And every other month, there are the TAM webinars if you're following the whole series. And just as a final reminder, for more info, you can visit tpm-portal.com. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Christos, for kicking us off. Goodbye.